Hi, this is Paul. Today's video that I released was the one on natural law. As almost always with these big, long, meandering commentary videos, I'm doing a lot of thinking about, well, how are all these things coming together? And at least with some of the Winsome War conversations, I'm getting my camera adjusted here. I'm, in those sense, I'm engaging with my ecclesiastical and theological cousins. They tend to be young, restless, and reformed. The CRC is sort of old, um, troubled, and reformed. And the bigger issues I'm dealing with are issues of the meaning crisis, issues of, well, as you'll see with some of the videos that I'm about to play now, anyone who imagines that religion is just sort of going away, I don't think is paying attention. Even though, as I mentioned in this video, it's always difficult to sort of gain these far broader evaluations. It's part of the reason we sort of reach out for statistics and polling, but those are also quite imperfect tools. I want to begin. Well, I was on that streaming. I want to begin. Nate really grabbed this video. Ken Lowry, I haven't spoken with him yet, but he's another little corner of this little corner. He's got a channel, Climbing Mount Sophia, obviously a part of this new religious movements going on. And he had Jordan Wood, who is the author of The Whole Mystery of Christ, a book on St. Maximus the Confessor. I have not read the book. Nate Heil over at Grail Country has really been advocating, as he does here in the comments section. This was fantastic. Ken, one step closer to Jordan Wood being part of this little corner. It's going to happen. I can feel it. Well, it is happening, Nate. It is happening. And it's videos like this that are important. When I was sharing with Sam and Father Eric over on Jacob's Just Chatting channel, I was doing a little bit of reflection on what this little corner is. I think the heart of this little corner is creating a space for people to play along. Chad was in the comment section there. And Chad, of course, sort of stepped back from this little corner for a little while. And I don't think stepping back is a bad thing to do. I think people need to do that now and then. But the heart, in many ways, Chad is, although all of us are unique, Chad came into this little corner with the desire to participate. And that's really where I came into what I did with Jordan Peterson and the conversations and the commentaries. I saw what was happening with Jordan Peterson, and I wanted to play along. This is YouTube. You get to play along on TV too. And we'll, of course, let Grim do his commenting on that, because the breaking down of the fourth wall, virtually not alone, all of those key memes that Grim Grizz has brought to this little corner. And so what we're seeing here are a community of channels, but vital to that community of channels are the knitting together of relationships. Now, this is frustrating because the truth is, once relationships begin, hierarchies begin, because my channel grew of a size that I can't relate equally to everyone, and so then hierarchies develop, and that means I have some time for other people and not time for other people. And then we have preferences and relationships and friendships, and that whole dynamic goes and goes. It's a tremendously natural dynamic. It always sort of happens the same. But I think the heart behind this little corner is the idea that we can have the kinds of conversations we've always wanted to have. We can have better conversations because we're learning from each other. And the quality of the conversations is very much dependent on the relationships that we have between the people. And as Sam corrected me in this little talk, well, it's not like, we're the only ones having conversations with strangers on the internet and that goes well. No, people are able to do that. We've been doing it for a while, but we're wanting to have conversations about, I think, what is most important in life, and very much centers on religion. Many of us are religious figures. You can't see Father Eric with his collar, or, of course, I'm not wearing a collar as Jacob would like me to, but I am a Christian Reformed minister. Sam, of course, is a biblical Unitarian. And so in that little chat with Father Eric and Sam, we talked about that. and just being able to jump into a stream and have a conversation with someone. It's very Protestant. It's very American. If you want to put in the time, chances are you will find a niche in this little corner. But it's something you usually sort of have to earn, and it's usually sort of have to earn it by putting in the time and um, bringing value to other people. Now, Hezi, who I did a randos conversation with a little while ago, has been doing a lot of live streams on Jacob's channel, and I think doing some of the best ones. I think Hezi has really been contextualizing and bringing the question of the meaning crisis to an Israeli and a Jewish audience, and those are two different things. And like many of you, my knowledge of that little corner of the world continues to grow by listening to these individuals. I wanted, though, to start with this conversation and Jordan Wood's introduction here. I haven't listened to too much of this video yet, but I'm excited to. Nate, of course, is one of these. At some point, we're going to have tiers in this little corner, and there'll always be controversy about the tiers. But Nate just passed 1,000 subs on Grail Country, so good for him. And so Nate has become one of those nexus points for this little corner. Nate is also an in real life estuary leader. He's a part of Vendank's ElseNet network. So Nate is very much into this little corner and become a very big part of it. And he's been a very big promoter of Jordan Wood and Jordan Wood's recent book on St. Maximus the Confessor. And of course, if you listen to Jonathan Peugeot, you're a fan of St. Maximus. So on we go. Let's jump into this one.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for having me. I think
Now part I think of what is happening in this little corner is that we are in fact developing rituals, and part of the rituals that I think has grown out of at least my randos conversation is giving time for a little bit meatier self-introduction, and a self-introduction that has to do especially with one's religious orientation, even though the question of the connection between religion as we understand it and define it currently in secular modern society and how it plays out, those are very big questions, obviously, but a little bit meatier of an introduction in terms of who we are and how did we get here. So let's let this one go a little bit.
I guess my perspective, as is many people's, begins in childhood. I was one of those. I mean, I was raised in a religious home, and so you have religious. It wasn't Catholic or Orthodox or anything. It was pretty low church Protestant, and actually pretty much like biblicist, like pretty focused on just the Bible. When you get together on for church on Sunday, you might sing hymns. There might be a piano, maybe not. The minister is also the worship leader and all that stuff. So our minister was a farmer, actually. So that was.
And I know just by virtue of all of the randos conversations, his story, not unique. He's not alone in that, but every story is unique.
But you still have. I still sort of had this sense from like some of my earliest memories was, it's sort of cliche, I guess, but like laying in bed, like, well, if God is the creator of all things, who created God? And, so having these questions and then sort of being directed in my own tradition towards the Bible. It's like, hey, the Bible is inspired. It's got all the answers you want. You just have to read it and focus on that. So that was like my childhood all the way, in fact, up till college. I went to a small Bible college and basically had intentions to become a minister or a pastor in that tradition. But while I was there studying the Bible, which is sort of the direction I've been told I have to go, questions arise. Things don't make as much sense as maybe they initially did, or the very process of having to make sense, or you might say trying to climb this mountain that you were told, here's the only way to do it, here's the only path, or whatever. Questions arise. So that got me interested. I mean, like I said, the tradition I was raised in was very, at least sort of self-styled, almost ahistorical and individualistic, and there were varying trends. It wasn't centralized at all. There was nothing kind of holding it together other than your personal engagement with scripture, essentially. So I got interested in a wider question of history and tradition and what's been going on in the Christian tradition. That's where I started, was the Christian tradition. That's still where I am, broadly speaking. But that search, the questions that arose from trying to study scripture, and I mean like in the original, like Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic and Ugaritic and those other things, just because I was like, this is it, right? So anyway, got more broadly interested.
Now, again, this is it, right? It's the grammatical historical, the that sort of modernist beginning of, and okay, well, if I can know the original languages, then I can know. And but what you learn is that once you learn the original languages, first of all, you're not really necessarily inhabiting that original world as you did before. I've previewed the first episode of After Socrates, and I'm having a conversation with John Vervaeke about it, and we're going to talk about this inside outside dynamic because that's a very big part of this, as we're also dealing with religious pluralism, and in many ways, that's really a lot what this video is about, but also the meaning crisis in the context of religious pluralism.
Interested in the broad Christian tradition, how they had handled scripture. That was my inroad. Was if the Bible, if scripture is this inspired source or found from which wisdom, sort of comes down the mountain, in cascades, then I'm really interested in how other people have engaged that in this tradition. So it was really originally my interest in Christian tradition, broadly speaking, was in how they treated and handled and read script, Holy Writ. So that turned out to be fruitful, but also sort of caused more questions, because it turns out they weren't really reading the scriptures the way I had been taught to read them.
Now you could on one hand very much imagine sort of a Bart Ehrman turn here, where Bart Ehrman he was raised in a non-Christian home and then becomes a Christian in an evangelical ministry, and then decides he wants to go to learn more. So I think he goes to Moody Bible College and he learns there, and from there he goes on to seminary. And Bart Ehrman just deconstructs his way right out of the faith, and then still becomes someone who was a scholar of the New Testament at Duke University, writes books about skepticism, yada yada yada. So, well, that's not the only way this story turns, obviously.
So I was like, wait, hold on. What is this thing called allegory? What is this figurative stuff? Like, I don't understand that. So, in fact, I'd been told that that is a way to not take it seriously, right? Because then you can impose your own personal wishes and desires and truths and vision onto the text.
And that point that he makes right there is actually really important, because modernity and the grammatical historical way of interpreting scripture arose for a reason, and the dismissal of allegory arose for a reason, and the Protestant Reformation happened for a reason. Now, one way to understand a lot of human history is overcorrection, back and forth and back and forth, and a lot of what we're doing now, including now with the inclusion of cognitive science, understanding how we learn, thinking about history, we're just in the middle of a nexus of just a torrent of new information now suddenly available to everyone. And yeah, things are continuing to develop. So,
Jesus. Anyway, so I obviously had to wrestle through. I mean, that was my main question for a long time, was why do they think they can do this to scripture? Like, what justifies this? And so I landed on Origin of Alexandria, of course, as one does. And and I would say broadly that the Alexandrian Christian heritage, and even to this day, I would say, I mean, Maximus, in my opinion, stands in that tradition. Saint Maximus Confessor, he's the one I wrote the book on. That's the tradition that's the aspect or sliver or part of the tradition that has sustained me spiritually and personally more than anything else. I mean, there's so much else out there as well. I don't mean to diminish that, but for me personally, that's really what's that, along with engagement of a lot of modern Eastern Christian sources in different forms. In my early 20s, I read Dostoevsky's all of his works because I'd heard the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, Ron Williams, had done that. I thought, well, that sounds a cool thing to do. I'm gonna do that. So anyway, so there's been a lot of different.
The other
People,
Jordan Peterson would be proud.
oh yeah, yeah, the second history. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, that's the kind of that's where I'm coming from. I mean, it's always been a search. There's always been questions. There's always been things presented to me that on the surface initially made some sense, but then you start prodding a little bit and you realize that there's so much more. Not only perhaps the surface doesn't make sense, but there are so many other surfaces below that one
Mm-hmm.
that you start contemplating. Right? And it's almost like it is exactly as you have pitched this. You know, it's this sort of climb. And it seems like you can't see the top. The summit is sort of impenetrable because of the haze, as it were. Maybe it's the Mount Sinai or something. There's like a cloud settled on top, but um, and so you constantly are progressing. And so yeah. Anyway, broadly Christian, but not really. You might say historic Christianity, if you want to use that label. That wasn't my background, but I found my way into that. And then since then, I've often been, like maybe his Origin's fault. He's sort of the one who poisoned my well early on, but I have always been attracted to those that somehow were able to strike the balance between an amazing rootedness, as it were, in the history and tradition, but also with an incredible sense of creativity
Mm-hmm.
and of speculative imagination, and an ability to not just answer questions that are unresolved, but to generate new ones. This sort of ever flowing fount pouring forth, and those are the people that have really captured my attention and sort of my mind and my spirit. So that's I'm now Catholic. I became Catholic about, was it like 8 years ago, something like that. I became Catholic 8 years ago, and there's a whole backstory there, and probably a lot of my co-religionists perhaps regret that I did become Catholic, and that I remain Catholic, because I don't always feel like the most comfortable as one, but it's sort of an ongoing wager for me. It's like, Catholic, universal, católicos, like it, if anything is true, it should surely be able to be accommodated by that perspective, even if the tradition itself doesn't yet recognize that. And this is sort of the way it goes. So anyway, that's where I'm at now. So I'm a Roman Catholic who is mostly, almost always, spiritually and personally and intellectually sustained by Eastern sources, Greek all the way up through Russian thinkers, and yet my earliest background is really Protestant primitivist, biblicist. So I'm now a father. I've got 4 children, and I do find that, and I'm a stay-at-home dad actually. So I do find that my most existentially perhaps useful objects of meditation come from my children now. So
Wow, that's a great little randos introduction to an author who's written a rather expensive book that I haven't read yet. I'm not gonna. I'll plunk down $10 for a book that I may or may not get to, but I'm not gonna plunk down $40 for a book that I may or may not get to. We'll see. But again, part of what's developing is a tradition around how to do introductions, and that's a great rando style introduction. And I want to then go to this one. So Jacob has been really wanting me to have a conversation with Rabbi Rafi Mollet, which I'm certainly open to. But as I said in this little corner, it's an organic thing, the way this community sort of gets knit together, and there's different corners of this little corner, and part of the real gift of this little corner is being able to talk across barriers and compare notes across barriers and learn about things that confront us. So, and I think Chezi, what he's doing, just have a world of admiration and respect for Chezi, and how he's handling himself and what he's pursuing with this. So let's go here.
I wanted to know if we could just do just a small introduction. I don't know sort of your background story so much, or like where are you coming at this from? What are you doing in this space? What does the rabbi do?
Okay, a small introduction. I don't know how to make a small introduction, but okay. So my back.
First of all, this guy's from Brooklyn, and I don't know how old he is. He looks younger than I am, but he and I definitely didn't grow up too far from each other.
Background is I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I mentioned that Jacob's broadcast. Did I freeze? Am I still with you?
You're with me.
Yeah. For some reason, I keep seeing myself freeze, but I don't know why. As I mentioned on Jacob's channel, I grew up in a bit of a Jewishly confusing home because my two parents grew up secular and my father became religious after they married and my mother did not. You know, it was kind of like, well, I didn't bargain for this and we got married, so I don't agree to it. But so I grew up with kind of that mixed message of, you know, keeping Torah on one hand and not keeping Torah on the other hand. And my parents split up and, you know, I had to go through a lot of personal soul searching to decide on my path. And it wasn't always simple to know which way things were going.
Now this is as you can tell if you look down at the bottom, this is a 5-hour live stream. So those of you who are looking to learn a lot, there's a lot of nomenclature in here that I don't understand, but there's a lot in here, and I've listened to probably most of it now, and I'm in a little bit of it at one point. I played some of that in the last video, but again, part of this little corner is also the learning channel, and doing a lot of learning about the way in this conversation, the way the meaning crisis. So the way the meaning crisis and the way modernity, technology are just disrupting long historical religious communities, but also at the same time, in some ways, breathing new breath into them. Isn't that interesting?
But in all that mess, I got a modern Orthodox education and I would say a prestigious modern Orthodox school. I got involved with NCSY, which turned me on really to Yiddishkeit. I would say prior to that, what my modern Orthodox education had accomplished was to turn me off totally from Judaism and make me want to be anything but Jewish. And I was pretty set that that was the path I was going to take.
Now, I thought this comment was tremendously interesting because it sounds a lot like a lot of evangelical deconstruction, doesn't it?
Was jump off the deep end into, you know, just being anything but Jewish. And when I accidentally ended up involved with NCSY, and for the viewers who don't know, it's a youth group that's not school oriented. It's what you might call informal education or experiential education. It's a youth group for Jewish teens from any background, and I got involved with that almost accidentally, which is a long story that I won't go into. But I would say in that environment, I was finding myself enjoying being Jewish and doing Jewish things for the first time in my life. And at the end of my high school years, it made me think, like, I was on the path to say, like, when I turn 18, I'm out of here. And now I almost feel like I discovered something new that I don't even really know what I'm abandoning. And I thought I did, but now I see I don't. So that's when I decided to.
Again, you can find very interesting parallel stories amongst evangelicals, and that's why, again, part of what we're dealing with here is pluralism. So you have these patterns that obviously cut across different religious frameworks. Does that make them all the same? No, there's plenty to disagree with, and there's some disagreeable people around, but just fascinating listening to his story, and he's going to keep going. Then we're going to get into Chezi's story a little bit more.
To go to Israel for the year after high school, which a lot of people with that upbringing do, but I was totally opposed to it, and I changed my mind on that. I ended up spending a year in Or Sameach, the yeshiva that Jacob mentioned, followed by finishing my college degree or doing a college degree altogether. But I would say that 1 year in Or Sameach, when I was in this very warm, nurturing, mature yeshiva environment with teachers who were extremely scholarly, but also at the same time warm and embracing, kind of like a family. And I lived in a community where people were very committed to Torah, and Torah kind of defined their life in a way that I had never seen in the modern Orthodox world, where it's just kind of like you're like, growing up, my identity was like, I'm an American kid who happens to be Jewish, and my obligations as a Jew kind of get in the way of the other part of my identity, being the American kid I want to be. Judaism was in the way, stopping me from being happy. And here I saw a place where people, their entire life was defined.
This Judaism was in the way, stopping me from being happy. An American kid, definitely.
By Torah. It wasn't just like a hobby, it was life itself. And I got very turned on by that, and getting to know some of these families, going to Shabbos meals and things like that. I just saw something I had never seen before. And I said, this is so beautiful. I want this, So even though I went to college, and that's a whole other story, my basic overall trajectory was, I want to go back to Yerushalayim, that's Jerusalem. I want to go back into Torah study, and I want to build the kind of life that I saw there that others were building. And I did that. After college, I went back to Jerusalem to study in Or Sameach. I got married. I spent a number of years in the Kollel, which is basically what married men who study in the yeshiva are called a Kollel. And I got some rabbi papers while I was at it, training in pedagogy and Jewish outreach, what we call kiruv, what's called rabbinic leadership, and I ended up actually falling so in love with the lifestyle that I stayed in Jerusalem, building my family for about 7 years in various yeshivas in Kollalim, including Torah's Moshe, also known as Tomo, for those who are aware. I learned in Rav Yitzchak Berkowitz's Kollel, the Jerusalem Kollel, which is quite well known. Rabbi Berkowitz today is the Rosh Yeshiva, the dean of the Eish HaTorah Yeshiva, which is very well known. And eventually, 7 years and 3.5 kids later, because we had our fourth on the way, we moved to New York. I taught in New York for 3 years. And then we moved to Seattle, Washington, where I taught for 8 years. And now we're living in Houston, Texas, where I'm teaching. And all along, I always felt that the same fire that was ignited under me, I felt all along the way I had that ability to kind of light other people's fire. That was the experience I had interacting with others, is that just like I was fired up, I was able to get other people fired up about Torah and Judaism. And it was very rewarding and fulfilling for me to be able to do that, which is why I pursued a career in education. But when I kind of found the online space, I saw potential there to do much more than what I was doing in my quote unquote 9 to 5. So
now I should interject here that I've had a fair amount of conversation with Jacob, and the Jewish community is quite concerned that they not be understood as proselytizing in anything like this. Although someone growing up in, say, a church that Jordan Wood grew up in might say, boy, that sure sounds like a testimony story, and it's going to be followed by an altar call. But that's not the purpose here. And my understanding of his mission is to, as I talked about with respect to negative world, neutral world, positive world, Tim Keller makes the observation that in Christendom, Protestant America, the goal is to energize dormant Protestants. And my understanding of his goal is to energize secular, irreligious Jews into wanting to study Torah. Now, there's a ton of interesting talk in this whole video about Torah, and when we get into Chezi's story, we'll get into a little bit more this question of, okay, well, how does this work when you flesh it out. Now, one of the things that is deeply part of American religious liberty is allowing small religious groups to not only maintain individual freedom, but to allow small religious groups to practice their religion together. That's if you get into questions of religious liberty in America, those issues come up a lot because part of the reality about religion, even within a secular frame, religion is that you can't do it alone. And part of what's interesting as we're watching sort of this, oh gosh, what to call it? Sort of this individualistic, I mean, New Ageism is extremely individualistic. It's extremely evangelical. There's no hierarchy. It's sort of you be you, you practice you, whatever works for you. If you find someone who's sort of on the same page, that's great, but you're not going to gather anything or build anything together. Now, this is very interesting doing this video on the advent of talking to John Vervaeke about his project, because these issues will come up. None of this stuff is irrelevant. So I was just really struck by his introduction here, and that, again, if you grew up in a church like Jordan Wood just described, you would say, boy, this sounds like testimony time, where I grew up in a broken home and it was secular, and then I found Torah and I found studying it, and I found this whole beautiful way of life. Hyun Shu has recommended Rami to me, which is a show on Hulu. The show is quite vulgar. Apparently it's a stand-up comedy that does it. So especially in the first episode, there's a lot of sexual vulgarity in it. But what struck me about that show, though, is here you have this young Islamic kid growing up in North Jersey and trying to weed his way through his roots and religion. And again, this idea that religion is going away, the modernist subtraction story is dead. It's just dead. And even though we see people deconstructing, so on and so forth, they're not deconstructing into some sort of Sam Harris. Even Sam Harris has an app about what many Christians would look at as quasi-religious meditation, okay? So religion isn't going anywhere. It's never disappeared. We just sort of added some new definitions to create sort of this space of secularity whereby we could stop killing each other over many of these ideas. But, well, we'll get on to Chezi's speech once Rabbi Mola is done.
Over time, I kind of created this online persona and different social media accounts where I try to spread my excitement for Torah in the various ways that I do. I would say it's still at something of a fledgling state, but that's kind of where we find ourselves now. People have, thank God, been attracted to my teaching, and so I've been invited on different platforms, like Jacob mentioned, Tanakh Talk now, which is a rather large channel where I teach regularly. I'll be teaching this afternoon, the Parsha class. Jacob reached out to me, having seen me on that platform. We connected and finally spoke kind of face-to-face, quote-unquote, yesterday. Now we're talking, so that's kind of where I've been and where I am now.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing. That definitely puts things into certain context for me. I'll give you a little follow-up on myself, and then we'll dive in a little more. So, born and raised in Israel. My mother and father made Aliyah, ascended. They moved to Israel in the early 80s, a few years following my twin.
And again, Jacob could do a commentary video on this because they drop terms and I listened to them. I'm like, I don't know what that means.
Sister and I were born here. The rest of my siblings were born in the States. But I grew up here all my life. What you would consider, again, these terms are sort of loose terms, but Dati Leumi, so national religious, which is sort of like Israel's version of modern Orthodox, but potentially at times considered a little more religious, but I don't know if that's even true anymore. But definitely a very Torah-filled family, and the pursuit was while there was definitely a modern pursuit of, my father's a professor, my mother I mean, she taught Torah, but she also was an educator. But there was constant learning, and that was sort of the framework around that. So my father was a psychologist that was being, doing psychology via the prism of the Torah, and then how that relates to many different things. So that was always the framework. I, after high school, went into what's called in Israel Hesder program, which is you learn and you do the army, but I stayed there a little longer. I ended up being there 6 years. I also started on a track for my rabbi papers, but I was doing it for the money and the women. So I stopped. Exactly. I stopped midway.
That's interesting.
And in my army services, I was a chaplain in the Air Force, and I spent, when I came back from the army, I did 2 more years in yeshiva. It's in the old city called Yeshiva Kotel, the Western Wall yeshiva, and I was it's called a sho'elu mashiv. You get asked some questions, and sometimes you have an answer for them. And I would give some classes on some Jewish philosophy and theology. But ultimately, I then left that track, got married, went into law school, worked as a lawyer, stopped, and went into a design and architecture career, and have been doing that for the last 10 years. Wow. So definitely got off that track. However, I have always been doing my own learning, and I hopefully growing internally and externally. But I have the opportunity to constantly be interacting with different clients of mine usually from the States, and they come from different. Some of them are Reform, some of them are modern Orthodox, some of them are what we would call yeshivish, I guess, which are a little more. How would you best categorize that?
A good question. I mean, like yeshivish, right?
So,
people
so
say ultra orthodox. People say,
sure. So more. I mean,
it's.
I take some offense to that, not from you, obviously, but yes. So a little more orthodox, or seemingly so, and I, due to the nature of my job, when I'm with them, so it's usually 3 to 4 days of intense shopping. Now, I pick them up early in the morning at around 9. I drop them off at around 8 o'clock at night. It's a lot of driving around Jerusalem. We can't be talking about what color their tile is for all those hours. So we always get into education, religion, the status of the Jewish people. These are things that are on my mind constantly. As it relates to this little corner of the internet, they discuss the meaning crisis a lot, and I was seeing how, while in many ways religions in general and Judaism, I think also specifically, has been protected in a certain way from the meaning crisis. However, I do feel that it is making its way towards religions in general and Judaism, and I was trying to anticipate or try to see, what this means towards the community. So, having said that, because the conversation with Jacob, while informative, was sort of a mix of conversations, I was thinking of discussing sort of the interior status of the Jewish community with you a little, and then having a conversation about the exterior relationship that we have with other nations, other religions, potentially, if that would be okay with you.
Yeah, well, I'll see what I can contribute.
Now, stupid car. Now, what Hezi, first of all, his what he's basically getting an opportunity, because as he described, just by virtue of his job, he's talking to deeply Jewish people. I'm sure some of these people are moving to Israel from the United States, and they're doing so for religious reasons. Again, for me, just having lived in gospel studies for such a long time as a pastor, just thinking about all of these, the book of Acts in chapter 6, where you have these Hebraic widows and diaspora widows all in Jerusalem, the Greek-speaking widows. You've just got people moving to Israel, having lived out in the diaspora, and then coming back to the motherland, yada, yada, yada. And then he starts talking to them. And so part of what I later on, I don't know if I'll play it in this video or not, I played it in my last video. Part of why I'm so interested in these conversations is when you're discussing these things within a Christian frame, it gets very difficult because a lot of the confessional differences and historic disagreements will sort of bubble up, and we can sort of lose sight of, well, what is technological disruption doing to us? What is globalization doing to us? And as I also mentioned to them, one of the interesting things, and you'll see this in my Sunday school class, is that when you look at the way the Bible deals with the universal and the particular, Israel is almost always dealt with as sort of a microcosm of the world. Your priesthood of all believers. Well, priests are sort of a separate class set aside. Priesthood of all believers. Sorry, Jacob. Book of Exodus, priest to the nation. So Israel is my chosen people, priest to the nation, so on and so forth. And what has happened in, maybe I will play some of that because Joseph comes on to the live stream and we talk there too. But what I see, and this isn't the first time that Hezi has brought this up. This is obviously part of what has drawn him to the little corner. This is something that he's looking to work through, and he's looking to work through by sort of watching Christians and comparing notes with Christians, because he's obviously watching me, but also then obviously comparing notes with all these different factions of Judaism. Now, when Jacob came out to Sacramento and he and I went to Outback Steakhouse, I had a good chance to let Jacob educate me on the innumerable factions of Judaism and what all of the labels mean, and they often don't mean anything like they mean in Christian terms. So there's this whole other world that it takes a little while to get up to speed with. But again, watching the parallels of the meaning crisis rippling through a place like Israel, and again, part of what draws me to this is that I watch, for many Protestants, America is their lost kingdom. Protestants had nearly unique control of the cultural and political entity that was the United States before the Second World War. A lot of what happened in the Roosevelt administration, Franklin Roosevelt was one of the first who brought in Jewish cabinet members, Catholic cabinet members, to the point that Aaron Wren just recently did a video on why Catholics are in many ways outperforming Protestants in terms of becoming elites in American society and particularly in American conservatism. It's a really interesting thing. Got to be careful how I word this, thinking of Dave Chappelle and Kanye West. I'll say it this way. Many Jews have thrived in America and have ascended to some of the highest levels in society and culture. We have not yet had a Jewish president, but many Jews in America have ascended to the highest places in the culture. And so over the last 75 years, Protestants have in some ways been the ones who have sort of had to take a step back. And now we currently have a president who identifies as Roman Catholic. I'll let all of you Catholics fill in the comment section on that. But most of our presidents have been Protestant and continue to be Protestant of one flavor or another. But this is a big part of what's going on in terms of the winsome wars and the politics in America. And so it's just absolutely fascinating to me watching Hezi and Yosef and many Jews process this question of, you actually have a state of Israel, and it's increasingly non-secular. What on earth does that mean? How is it supposed to work? And it's not an insignificant state. And of course, this is going on all over the Islamic world in varying degrees, and is now going on in India, that has become their latest president, much more self-consciously Hindu, raising the tensions and much more violence between Hindu and Buddhist populations. It's going on in China, suppression of certain Islamic populations. Religion's back on the menu, boys, and we've all got a lot of work to do on this. And Hezi is definitely working through these issues, and he sits in a rather particular, unique place to talk to people and to just have good conversations with people about, okay, and as it turns out, well, you're designing kitchens. How many stoves will you need? Because of course, meat and milk and all of these dietary things. So I just find this aspect very interesting, and I think perhaps potentially productive in terms of trying to think through the kinds of conflicts in my own sub communities and cultures.
Right.
You know,
So
I don't
one
consider myself an
is
expert.
one is on the interior front. So this is something that I've been on my own little crusade, and I've been talking to some more prominent rabbis in Israel about these topics, and it would be interesting to me sort of to gauge where you're coming at this from your position. So as someone who does his best to adhere to the guidelines and lifestyle of an Orthodox Jew, to the best of my understanding, it is very important for me to maintain this divine operating system we have called Judaism. And I think it's fantastic. I think it's wonderful, Judean Christian values and where the world looks at today. So there's a whole nice package that Judaism comes with. However, due to its divine nature and its system that it's built over the last 2,000 years of exile, there are times when the Jewish community and Jewish leadership is required to make adjustments or certain changes, which we believe to be divine changes through their authority to do so, that allow us to adapt properly for the changing times. So,
okay, and so there you see the problem of adaptation, which I've mentioned many times. If you read the book of Exodus closely and Deuteronomy closely, you'll see adaptation. And the Jewish part of the difficulty here is that Protestantism is so deep in American life and culture that until this gets into, again, the positive, neutral, negative world, through most of the 20th century, being Protestant was just being a good person in America. The practices and lifestyles were so embedded. Now you had different ethnic versions of Christianity that had their particularities. For example, I've often said that in the Christian Reformed Church, we were fairly Sabbatarian. That was not unique to the Christian Reformed Church, but we were fairly Sabbatarian, and I was dating my wife, whose mother was dispensational Baptist, and so we wouldn't go out to eat or purchase anything on Sunday. They would go out to eat on Sunday. We could drink alcohol and smoke. They couldn't do those things. So you had particularities, but so much of the culture, there was such a deep cultural agreement between Protestantism in America and America. Okay, so of course Jews and Catholics were in some ways out. In the middle of the 20th century, Jews and Catholics were let into the club. Obviously, after 9/11, there was a big conversation to what degree can Muslims be enfolded into this, brought into this supposed melting pot that is America, and European nations having a more difficult time on that because obviously French is an ethnicity, and so going from an ethno-national to a credo-national state is a very difficult one. But Hezi is, working through the meaning crisis in real time in a Jewish state that was created in many ways. I mean, it isn't in some ways the nation of Israel one giant Benedict option? I mean, think about it that way. Okay, now you've got control. What are you going to do with it? How much of that Torah will you bring in? what kind of interpretation and change and adaptations can all of you agree with? How will you come to those agreements, especially when I go back to my conversation? I don't want to mention her name because we had to take her videos down, but a young Catholic woman who was living amidst sort of Benedict optioning Catholics in America, wrestling with that, and you get this intensification in the community.
So whether it's an example of an extreme example of one should not write down the oral Torah, to then the need to write down the oral Torah, to one should not get paid for teaching Torah, to then we could now get paid to teaching Torah. One should not teach women Torah, and we then managed to find the room where that happens. And while people could look at that as, you know, how is it happening with a divine system? If we look at ourselves as constantly growing and constantly digging in deeper and understanding more, we could see how these truths are always there. However, so far, the religious community and leadership has been successful in being reactive to the world changes and making these changes slowly and methodically. It is a very dense web, and even if there's seemingly things that seem less relevant for cultural reasons, historical reasons, medical reasons, it's not so easy to just, you know, take out that Jenga tile, because you might be damaging the foundation. And one has to take that obviously very seriously when considering making these changes. However, I do believe that increasingly the rate of change in society, technological, psychological, and now biological and technological, are happening in a rate that far surpasses anything the Jewish community or the community in large has ever dealt with. And from what I've seen from my conversations is I get answers where I get looks of, yes, what you're saying is an issue. Yes, we understand. And my issue to them always is, but I'm a designer architect. Like, why am I having this discussion with you? You know, like these are your discussions to be having. I'm just here saying, hey, you know, the canary in the coal mine. So the examples I give them would be.
And the question is, well, shouldn't and I don't even know the names of all the different Jewish institutions, but shouldn't this be a conversation you're having with your rabbi? Shouldn't this, I mean, in Christian terms, I said, this should be what the church and the pastor is all about. And this is part of the reason for the development of Estuary and the development of this little corner, to have these conversations, because we've got a lot to talk about. And whereas we might not have 613 commandments we've got to deal with, and actually Rabbi Mollet has a very interesting conversation a little bit later about, well, Gentiles don't have to. And that, for me, then, that just, you know, am I a Jew or not? Well, you know, does my genealogy go back to David? There's a bunch of Cohens in my family tree, so, or maybe Levi. I don't know. I mean, these categories then suddenly are important. And obviously, in a Jewish context, in some ways, there's a lot less fluidity than, let's say, in a Protestant context like I grew up in.
You know, there's a CRISPR technology. I don't know if you're aware of CRISPR technology.
It's with the genes and things
correct.
like that.
So in China, the doctor was arrested, but he took 2 embryos and made sure they can never get AIDS. And he also played with their intelligence. Now, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, when I'm tweaking genes, are we telling people, no, you shouldn't pick the best of your genes for your child, and how tall he's going to be and how smart he's going to be? And what does community in large and the Jewish community think about that? Are we not doing that? And then our kids are not competing with other kids? If you are tweaking my IQ, what are my responsibilities toward my family, toward my learning? If I decide to do so and my wife doesn't want to do so, would that be a reason to divorce her? Because now we are completely having different understandings of reality. If I could clone all my body parts, should I do so? And if so, can I live more reckless lives? if the whole Jerusalem eventually moves to be a smart city, also 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, my fear is not only does religion know how to somehow adapt to that, it's also the mindset of there are
You,
families today in some communities where a child will have a relationship with the Sabbath, and him thinking he's doing something that, let's say, would be problematic from the law point of view, but then he finds out that in 20 years it's no longer problematic. However, his relationship is destroyed with his mother based on something that at the time she thought this is exactly what God wants, or at the time this is what God. These are what the rabbis are telling me what God wants, and now it's easier to look back 1,000 years and be like, well, that change happened now. It's going to be much harder to have that conversation if 10 years I look back and I'm like, well, that was different. And then again in 10 years being like, well, that change happens. And I think to myself, when another example would be, and this is not to sound too controversial, but out there in the world, right? If I grew up in a quote modern house, and I wanted to do my report about Moses for school. So I go to my father, and my father goes to his library and gives me some books. Seemingly with a new AI little chat that's going on right now that is just giving you answers, or the second Elon Musk gets this in my head, which he's already doing now with Neuralink, I'm not going to ask my dad for the information for the report. I'm just going to do the thing. And then I'm going to go to my dad or my teacher that's not ready for this response. And I'm going to tell him, dear teacher, what do you think about the fact that Ramesses II's tomb is like the exact size of the tabernacle? And who's this Freud guy? And what is he talking about Moses? And there's a guy named Sargon of Akkad that he predates our story in like a basket. So what's that? And if the teacher has no frame of reference how to deal with this, or 7 kids coming to him and being like, wait, or a student coming to a rabbi and asking him a question, rabbi gives answer, and then student shows him 17 different answers online from around the world of quote unquote bona fide rabbis. What is his response? What does that make to the trust between those rabbis? That's
Pluralism, information, it's all there.
That would see like my interior concern is, as I see the communities are bifurcating, I get very nervous that we end up turning into really different sects of religions and turning into different versions of how we relate to God. And while in exile, something like that there was room for that with the 70 faces of the Torah. When you have now on the ground a government that, if I took a zoom out, I'd be like, wow, the most religious government in Israel, maybe since the time of King David. Look at this. But I could zoom in and be like, but is this what Judaism necessarily looks like? And can I find myself exiled again, potentially, because of the shenanigans that happen over here? And is it worth these sort of political fights and how this is manifesting? So I would say I'll stop off with that little tangent, but you can let me know about your thoughts.
Oh my goodness.
That was a good tangent. That was a good rant, because there's just so much in it. And yeah, like I said, this is a 5-hour live stream, and I'm running out of time right now. But I wanted you to hear that little rant because, okay, so on one hand, we've got Jordan Wood, and he becomes a Christian. And, he was a Christian, but now he goes into origin and historic Christianity. And historic is one of these words, like, that word's gotten retconned. How are we going to deal with that word? And here, Rabbi Rafi Mollet has grew up in this broken home, secular family. His father became observant. And then he found this beautiful life and went to Israel and found a wife and has had some children and is teaching Torah and has a promising career as a teacher, and he's been to New York and Seattle and Houston and all of this. And so now he's online, and he's using online tools to help activate dormant or secular Jews into being observant. And now, of course, Hezi is on sort of the other side of this circle saying, yeah, but I'm supposed to be living the dream here in Israel because this is kingdom come. And of course, this sort of rings true for, longing for Constantinople, or, finding the truth in Rome, or maybe even Grand Rapids, Michigan, for those of you who know the Christian Reformed Church. Ground center here in the meaning crisis.
It is ready for the changes that are happening. Do you think those changes are different than before?
Do I think the religious community is ready for the changes that are happening? And do I think, what was the second part?
Do I think those changes differ from the changes that Judaism has dealt with all its life? And I'll just put into context, there is an issue in Judaism called aguna. And this is, to be very brief, an issue with if a woman and husband decide to end their marriage, but the husband is being very difficult with giving his wife his get, her divorce deed, he could essentially hold this over her head and not allow her to achieve a single status, which means she can't marry. And there are other ramifications for the fact of if she has children with someone else during this limbo status. And what does that mean? Now, there are solutions around this. However, it's been many years since there's been headway about this. And my point is about this is when I've challenged other rabbis about this, I told them 40 years ago, you wrote this article. It's 40 years since. There still isn't movement. And I'm saying that's small potatoes compared to AI getting into someone's brain and then us having that discussion. And is it crazy of me to think that that's not 200 years from now? That is, it's knocking.
And I think about the Christian Reformed Church debated women in ecclesiastical office from the 70s into the 90s. And the Christian Reformed Church has been dealing with homosexuality, same-sex marriage since the 70s. And Hezi's point here is the speed, and just the speed of culture in an internet age versus the speed of religious communities and their sense-making. The differential here is really, really difficult in religious communities. And a lot of what this does is if law, basically it throws everything back to law. Because at least in a place like the United States, now how this will go in Israel, I don't know, but a place like the United States, well, part of the promise of secularity is that maybe if your church doesn't like the fact that you need a divorce and you're getting one, you can walk away from your church. And if you can't walk away from your church, then they're going to be called a cult. So, this gets back in some ways into our marriage crisis conversation.
A lot of what you said, particularly about the rapidity with which times are changing, so to speak, in quotation marks, more than has ever been. In other words, where a generation used to be 20 years or 50 years, right? A generation is now 2 years, and it's probably going to be even quicker. Meaning, what I mean by that is I have kids. I have 3 teenage daughters, and the challenges that my eldest daughter had when she was 14 and 16 and now 18 are totally different than her sister when her sister turned 14 and then 16, which is totally different from what her sister faced now that she's 14. So it's like in a different way, my 14-year-old is now dealing with the things that my 18-year-old is dealing with.
But she's
and
14.
so is my 16-year-old. She's only 14. She didn't have those extra years to catch up because the world has changed so much from the time my eldest was a freshman in high school to the time my youngest is a freshman in high school, that my youngest's challenges are totally different than my eldest's challenges, and the gap between the way my kids are kind of turning out, if you want to put it that way, from the eldest to the youngest is so huge. Just because each one within those few years, less than a handful of years, are coming into a completely different world than their sibling did 2 years before that. When they entered high school, they entered the world of social media, when they entered the world of cellular phone technology and the like. So, my wife and I are in touch with that, and we definitely have to contend with this constantly.
Now he gets into this a lot in terms of a kosher phone, which was fascinating, where, okay, the rabbis are, okay, these are the apps that you have to have on your phone. But then a little bit later, I should find this section. It's hilarious.
Telling me, I'm going a little bit of a tangent, but
No,
somebody was telling me, my kids were telling me, my daughters were telling me that the new drug dealer in yeshiva, now imagine the yeshiva, this is the place of Torah learning. This is the four walls of the study hall that are going to protect us. And I remember when I'm going on a tangent within a tangent. Remember when cell phones became ubiquitous, and Rabbi Wallerstein was lamenting how the Satan, right, Satan has finally found his way into the study hall. It used to be the study hall was our sanctuary, was our safe haven. We went into what the Gemara says, right? What does the Talmud say? If the evil inclination grabs hold of you, what do? You grab hold of him back and you drag him to the study hall, and you sit him down in the study hall and you study Torah. He can't have power over you there. And that's very profound and it needs to be understood, but that's another conversation. But I remember he said, finally, the Satan has found a way into the base medrash, because now everybody's got in their pocket this little machine. And this was before smartphones, where you could watch. He says you could watch the boys in the study hall, watch them like Pop-Tarts. You watch, all of a sudden one pops up, and then of course another guy pops up. Everyone's popping up, pop, 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 and they have to walk out. Why? Because their phone's buzzing. They got a text, they're getting a call, right? So when that started happening, I remember in yeshiva by us, they put a sign on the wall: no cell phones allowed inside. You have to leave it out. So you can't bring it in unless you're in the kollel and you're married, your wife's 9 months pregnant, whatever it is, But he finally found a way. That's just today. And today, what do we? So back then it was like no cell phones, no texting. No. Now we're like, okay, listen, let's put filters on the phone, so there's no video capability or no pictures, but like texting already, where we've
and again, I can just hear these things in small conservative Christian communities.
We've given up. In other words, the walls are caving in slowly. We're losing that battle. And
but is it even the battle we are supposed to be fighting, or is that we?
So here's where I'm going in my long-winded way. My daughter, I just want to roll back to the tangent. My daughter is telling me that the new drug dealer in yeshiva, it's not like it was before. Not that I ever encountered this, but one might imagine someone is, he's peddling over here some type of controlled substance. He says now it's smartphone plans, meaning everybody has to have a kosher phone. Kosher phone means that the parents have put filters on the phone. It's approved by the rabbis. It has a stempel, seal of approval. The rabbis say this smartphone you can have because we have stripped out of it the ability to damage you too much, right? So the kid has his kosher phone. Okay, mom, I'm going to yeshiva with my kosher phone. Hey, rabbi, look, I've got my kosher phone. Then behind closed doors, you have a guy. He's dealing phones. He's selling in yeshiva unlocked, unfiltered phones, smartphones. And so everybody's got their kosher phone they walk through the door with, but in the other pocket, they've got their unlocked smartphones. This is the new drug. So our kosher phones aren't working because the kids are finding a way around it.
But
you're gonna block the internet in your house. The kid's gonna go to your friend's house and do
But
you don't know
it's
what
also
they're
going
gonna
to
do.
end up in his head.
Well, let's get there when we get there. But in general, I had a Rebbe, Rav Naftali Kaplan, Shlita, who I remember him saying, this. Just imagine what I'm telling you right now. We're living in Jerusalem. You can imagine this, and we're huddled around this great sage who's teaching us what we call musar, ethical teachings to work on building yourself. And this was a small, I would dare say it, secret
Ethical teachings that work on building. Is that on Chris Williamson's channel? Is this wisdom?
cabal of Musar studiers, okay, with Rav Naftali Kaplan, and he's taking questions from us. And one of the fellows asks, he says a couple of things. He says, "My wife wants a new kitchen, right? This is really a tangent, but she wants a new kitchen, right? But it costs money, and it's sort of a value for us to live modestly. Not only are we poor anyway, but it's almost a value to be poor. In other words, we're not into luxury. We want to live a simple physical existence and work on building the spirituality. But she wants to renovate the kitchen, right? What should I tell her?" He says, "Renovate the kitchen." He's like, "Yeah, but money, but gashmias, right? Physicality." He said, materialism, right? He says, "No, your wife breaks her back so you can sit all day and learn Torah like you want to do, and you think it's your privilege to do, and you think that you're serving God by doing." He says, "You give her whatever she wants. If she wants a kitchen, you get her a kitchen." Right? That's point one. That's a side point. But I want to tell you what comes out of the mouth. This is where I'm ultimately going to go. What comes out of the mouth of the Gedolei Torah when we actually ask them is very surprising, because unfortunately, and this was something I was saying to another person on Shabbos, the Jewish media, I should really say, like the Orthodox media, in particular the ultra-Orthodox media, the Haredi media, is controlled by a group of small-minded zealots who want to project a very specific message of what's okay and what's not okay. And this messaging is not coming from the Gedolei Torah. It's coming from the small-minded opportunists who have what to gain by controlling the narrative. But if we could get past them to the Gedolim and ask them their real opinions, you'll find out that they're much more progressive than the image they're given in the media. Much more progressive. Now, so someone asked Rav Naftali Kaplan. He said, my I don't know if it was his wife or who was asking for it. He says, should we get air conditioning? Should we get air conditioning? Now imagine there's a question to get air conditioning. And as an American, I can't imagine this. But in Israel, it was a very big struggle to have an air conditioner because it was very expensive. So most families in our position, if we were sitting and learning in Kollel in those days, you didn't have an air conditioner. It wasn't normal. What's that?
Said you had a fan.
You had a fan. To have an air conditioner was the lap of luxury. What are you, a millionaire? So he was saying, should he get an air conditioner for his kids, his family, whatever it was? And Rav Naftali Kaplan told him, yes, you should. And he said, yeah, but gashmias, right? Materialism, da-da-da. He says, guess what's going to happen? He says, your kids and their friends are going to want to play in somebody's house. You know whose house they're going to play in? The house with the air conditioner. Now, you don't know what's going on in that house, right? He says, don't you want your kids to say and to feel, and their friends to feel, your house is the most comfortable place for them to be, and they're going to be in the safety of your home, and that's where they're comfortable and where they want to be, and that's where you want them to be. Make your home the most comfortable place it could be, that your children are happy and they want to be there. Now, I'm going to extend this into the internet realm, is that, so you're going to say, no internet in our house, right? So then what do you think is going to happen? They're going to go to the other guy's house for internet, and you don't know what they're looking at over there, what they're doing over there. So here, to bring it back to when I spoke to this group, this is what I said. I said, every piece of technology that's coming into our kids' hands and our hands as adults, although we have more of a foundation to handle it safely than kids who are less mature and unprepared for it, right? He says, but you want your kids to be unprepared and to be slapped by these things in a dangerous environment where you don't have control and they don't have control. He says, we have to look at all these things as the stick. This is the mata. This is the mata. This is the stick. And the stick is as powerful as the wielder. So if you're not going to wield it, somebody else is going to wield it. And you don't know how they're going to wield it. And you don't know what the result of that is going to be. We have to pick it up and we have to wield it. And we have to wield it in the way that we know is useful and productive and healthy to do. And if we shy away from it and say usser, I promise you we're going to fail. And I promise you this is going to be the destruction of the next generation. So
is he team winsome? Team accommodation? Boy, just when I came across this conversation, I just thought, wow. The repeat of how many things. In the 1920s, the Christian Reformed Church wrestled with worldly amusements. No movies, no card playing. You could play rook, but not cards with, kings, queens, aces, these kinds of things. How many different communities have sort of gone through this? And again, up to Yosef's little speech towards after I jumped into this thing. Can't find it right now. I got to get home. But anyway. Why do I do what I do? I do what I do because it's fun, it's helpful, I'm learning a ton and making new friends, and leave a comment, participate. We need each other to figure this stuff out because it's really hard.